Good evening. A very warm welcome to this conference this afternoon here, organized together with me with the former Agriculture Commissioner Franz Fischler and the Rice Foundation, which I would like to thank very much for for the cooperation and the collaboration. Before entering into our works and into the content, I would like to inform you that this conference will be recorded, so it will be accessible online on different web pages, or also on the Rice Foundation after our event this evening. So why are we doing this conference right now? It is clear that also the culture, that also agriculture is part of the new Green Deal, which is somehow at the center of the political agenda of this commission, of the commissioner, of the president of the commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and her whole commission. And it's clear that agriculture, unfortunately, is part of the problem if it comes to climate change. We know that European agriculture emits 9.8% of the climate gases, active gases in the European Union, and we know that the agriculture sector needs to improve on this and needs to look how to emit less. But on the other side, I think agriculture has a very unique position, because agriculture is not only emitting, which is the negative part. Agriculture has the big opportunity to absorb more and to give a positive contribution to climate change. And this is the topic for us this evening. And here agriculture is really unique, because if we move something from A to B, or we travel from A to B, or we need to heat our houses, or industry needs to produce, there's only a question how to emit less. There's not a question how to absorb more. This is the unique position of the agriculture, and this positive input we need to give in agriculture. And I think we are just on time. Right, this morning, the final. I'm very confident on this. The final dialogue on the common agricultural policy started. It is ongoing. Tomorrow we will have the meeting with the ministers, and we will close this debate, which goes on for 3 years now. And this new common agricultural policy has important tools which can give a contribution. I would like to underline the possibility of the new eco schemes, where the Parliament asked for 30% ring fencing of the first pillar. This would mean a bit less than 15 billion euros a year on a European level for new eco schemes. The Council wants only 20%. Is much less ambitious on this as the Parliament, but we find a solution, or we find an agreement on this. I'm pretty sure in that. But we will have important, strong tools to convince farmers to invest into absorbing more, and absorbing more means mainly also to improve on agriculture practices and improve on carbon farming. If it comes on carbon farming, this is clearly connected with the Farm to Fork strategy. And I'm myself rapporteur on the agri side on the Farm to Fork strategy here in the European Parliament. And in the farming strategy itself, the Commission commits to a new strategy for carbon farming. And we have already, as you know, a document on the table from the Commission side on this. So I think this is really the very right moment to speak about carbon farming, about how to absorb more, having more humus in our soils, and give not only a positive contribution to climate change, but also improve possibilities for farmers in Europe, because humus has without doubt a positive effect on productivity. So this could really be a win-win situation for the climate and for the farmers and for the citizens and for the consumers. So thank you very much again, and I would like to hand over to Professor Alan Buckwell, who is the research director of the RISE Foundation. He will lead us through today's conference. Professor Buckwell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dorfman, and thank you for helping create this event with Franz Fischler. And welcome to all of you who are tuned in and listening to what I hope is going to be an informative and lively discussion on the issues that Herbert Dorfman has just explained. The RISE Foundation was very happy to participate in organizing this event. We're currently we've just started a few months ago a project on soils. Our last two projects were on crop protection, and before that, looking for the safe operating space for livestock. The RISE Foundation has always sought to find and to help illuminate the balance between profitable, viable agricultural systems and environmental security. And clearly that means dealing with the climate crisis and the other problems of that intensive agriculture causes of depletion of biodiversity and water and air pollution. And what's interesting is the extent to which managing soils better can contribute to several, if not all, of these problems. We're definitely in the listening and learning phase of our project on soils. And we particularly, we're delighted in the five speakers who we've got this afternoon agreeing to join us. We're going to look at some of the science background to climate and soils by Professor Kirkengast. And we're going to look at the regulatory issues with our colleague Josef Ivan from the European Commission. And then we will run through three practical examples. And in the RISE Foundation, in our project, we're keen to discover that how there's a lot of experience going on across Europe where this issue of soil management and soil health has been recognized for a very long time. And many people have devoted a lot of effort to creating initiatives to get real practical change on the ground. And we want to try and learn from as many of these as possible to kind of answer the question, well, how are we going to get these initiatives adopted on a much wider scale across the whole of our farmed environment? So with that just brief introduction, let's start. And I'm going to ask Professor Gottfried Kirkengast from the Wegener Center for Climate and Global Change in the University of Graz. He will introduce us to some of the scientific issues in carbon storage in agricultural soils. Professor Kirkengast, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm heard. Please, Professor Buckwell, just tell me if some problems pop up. Hello, everybody. I'm actually sitting at the countryside here, also in the research project. I use these slides here as a handout, actually, so you can ask the organizer also afterwards if you want to have this PDF document. And otherwise, if you can't read it well, just listen. What I speak, it's not an exhaustive talk, it's actually a keynote, and I want to drive home or share with you some bottom line messages. And this title here is saying this carbon storage in agricultural soils is a key part of carbon management. So first, take home message of this keynote that I can offer is on carbon management and why this agricultural carbon storage issue should be seamlessly integrated in what's called here carbon management. And I thank actually Dagmar Henner. Dr. Henner is a climate and land use research scientist in my group, and she supplied some slides from, let's say, some second or third bottom line message, which is more to the local scale practice of doing such agricultural carbon storage. Now, if you look at it scientifically, agricultural management at the nexus of being economic in conventional farming, in respecting the changes that's ongoing with carbon cycle, and that is carbon dioxide and methane, and also nitrogen cycle. So these greenhouse gases that relate to carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, so all is intertwined. And so if I'm farmer, actually I was grown up on a farm before just moving way beyond. So I know rather well actually from my own practice as a young man on how it is on a farm. So we have here a challenge with the greenhouse gas emissions, and Mr. Dorfmann was alluding to that. So that's where farming is an emission source. And then we have the chance in working with soils, in working with the land, to be, let's say, climate protection stewards also. And the background here, for example, in Austria, where I come from, this is the state of Styria in Austria. We just recently started a project that's funded by the government of the state of Styria, that farmers become climate protection steward, and we, on a larger scale, roll out a program here in Styria and in Austria later, that should help actually farmers also to create income and to do smart soil management using such carbon storage techniques. So with this introduction, I think I should give you this carbon management idea, since it was very recently that we published, and you find the web links here, that we published this approach, a new approach as it's called, to achieve Paris compliant climate goals. And public carbon management, that's what countries or states are concerned with, has to do with that there is a goal-driven, as it's called here, a solution-oriented transition for countries, for states, and for their governing and managing actors. And many of you will be in the policy making or in some lead administration. So you are governing and managing actors. So how can this transition to a low carbon country, in accordance with the European Green Deal, if you're in Europe, how can this be mastered? And this concept actually of carbon management, it has a range of definitions so that one is very clear who's the actors, the emission sectors, get a greenhouse gas reference budget, make reduction target paths, set up your actions and measures, quantify reduction rates, do some for decision support, do some quarterly annual emissions monitoring, and all that is guided by some decision support workflow. So if you're interested actually in carbon management as a concept, it is shown in this publication that is noted here, and explained in terms of public carbon management by way of the country of Austria. So if, like the country of Austria, like other countries in Europe, as part of the effort sharing, but also as part of the contribution to the European trading system, really wants to go for these deep reductions and successfully achieve deep reductions overall in emissions, so more than halving the emissions per decade. That needs a very solution-oriented, proactive management approach, and that is described here. And that is obviously also for companies and other organizations. But here we talk about public carbon management. And why is this? And there's some websites you can look at those, carbmanage.earth or pubcarb.earth. So you find all the background there on this what's called a solution framework for effective climate action compliant with the Paris climate goals. So the relation now to the agricultural carbon storage, let me show it by way of the example of the country of Austria. It could be any other country in Europe as well. We have a particular challenge as the country of Austria. We need, so we have not been that successful in emission reductions so far since 1990. So it's a steep reduction curve, but more or less every European country will need steep reduction curves, and part of the reduction, most of it, more than 90% actually, has to come from fossil and industry emission reductions. But then there's this carbon storage. And if you put it in the European context, and the speaker after me will talk about the European Commission context, if you look into this climate target plan of the EU, it's advertised, and correctly so, that the agriculture, forestry and land use sector, with the agriculture being a major player, is an essential element for having this part that makes the rest of fossil and industry emission reductions and this net emission path. And that can't, not to overstretch the system, to have natural carbon solution in agriculture, in forestry, in other land use change, to have natural climate solutions. It can only be sort of 5 to 10%. If you go through the numbers from the research, from the climate and land use and transformation research, as we did, you find that the plans actually, the quite proactive plans also of the European Commission, if you compare the total emissions that had been there as a reference in 1990, around 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents for the European Union, and the share that is envisaged for this part of natural climate solutions, which is also called removals here, can be sort of 5 to 10%. So in these scenarios that are illustrated here, it's around 7 to 8%. If you would look through the numbers that I used or we used here in Austria, it's again 7 to 8%. So relative to the emission amounts that are out there in the European countries and also in the EU as a total, it's a share of sort of 5 to 10% that should be mastered by natural climate solutions, and carbon storage in agriculture as store soil will be an integral part. And this is then we went for Austria. It's just a science example through the detailed computations of carbon budgets and carbon budget shares. But the bottom line message here, and I will drive it home with this graph, if you go for carbon management, for professional public carbon management, and this is a big graph you should possibly almost can't read, but it's just organizing the typical UNFCCC reporting or the IPCC common reporting format for these national emission inventories and also the EU emission inventory, organizing it into a management way. So we have here action areas from action fields in the energy, in the mobility, in the resource use, which I do not go into, but we also have stocks and land use. And if you look into an organized management approach on how you can really achieve deep reductions in a coordinated manner in this field of agriculture, forestry, and other land use, you find indeed that European policy that is intended now in the what we call AFOLU sector, agriculture, forestry, land use sector, to treat it more management-wise, more integrated is really important. And if you look through the what we call emission groups here in this carbon management approach, agricultural land and soils management is a critical part, since if you look at the other emission groups from a management approach, you find here the livestock enteric fermentation, the livestock manure management, the fuels use of agriculture, and then you find the links to the forestry, biomass, and so one has to look at this agriculture, forestry, land use sector, including other land uses like wetlands, other land use change, in an integrated manner. And you see here policy-wise that clearly this part of carbon storage, and in particular, so agricultural soils, arable soils, but also pastoral farming, arable farming, needs this integrated support. So the agricultural, let's say, community, or even from the policy research side, so I'm talking from science to policy, it's to be successful in the concert of fossil and industry that has to do a lot of emission reductions in these energy resources, mobility fields. This part has to find its, let's say, self-reliant way also to speak out and say, well, agricultural source management is a key component to ensure these net emissions, but it has to be done in a really integrated approach. So that is the first key message that I want to leave here, really, that we need to frame and understand the future over this decade, the policy of the EU, but also of the countries in such an actively carbon managed framework where agricultural soils, together with the other impacts of agriculture, which is partly emitting, partly stored. That's an integrated view, and that will help also at the economic side. So if climate protection steward should be another economic pillar for farmers in the future, if it comes to carbon pricing, and I will close out with my third key message on the carbon pricing. So by a well-accounted carbon storage in agricultural soils should receive obviously the carbon price per ton of CO2 equivalent that others pay for emission. So a smart farmer may earn more carbon price in storage compared to what the farmer would pay in terms of what everybody will pay in carbon pricing for emissions. So let's turn to the soil organic carbon. Here, actually, Dagmar Hanner, Dr. Hanner, who's working my group, has helped me, and there's one example. Jochen Buchmeier will bring examples from local scale here. So if you look at local scale and which options do we have, the bottom line message we have here is there is promising roads where we can keep on keeping yield in farming, but we can increase the long-term soil carbon storage clearly. And at the same time, keep soil water retention capacity. We can reduce water scarcity risks and also soil erosion risks. So there are studies, and Dagmar has, I don't worry, it's for the handout for you, but Dagmar has included here modeling results. So it's on a European scale, but also on local scales. So you do a combination actually of some hydrological modeling and some integrated, let's say, carbon balance modeling. Go through that, and if you do that, you can figure out, and that's what Jochen Buchmeier will talk about here. So here's really about a decade of real practice of carbon accumulation, humus, soil organic matter, and the data show that this is successful, and we have currently a research project to see whether it's really long-term successful so that it's accountable for as a contribution of farmers really for climate protection in the long term. So this is a hot research issue to have this long-term committed and reliable carbon storage over 30 years, 60 years, so over generations. And that is worked on, and then you can look through these modeling results. But what they actually show is that you can keep carbon to nitrogen ratio. So the yield parameters is there, and you can accumulate carbon. And if it's saturated, you can keep the carbon in the ground. So the carbon is no longer released. So active carbon management in farming, it is possible, better possible in organic farming, but it is possible also, well, in conventional farming. And it is possible also, I think that's the last slide there, showing us at 14 minutes. So it can also be combined actually with energy crops. So there's also research done here. So if you combine energy crops, it can make a positive greenhouse gas balance also, soil carbon accumulation and use of energy crops. And if you look at it at European scale, you find it's many regions over Europe where you can get some net soil organic carbon storage with high potential in European farmland, both grassland and cropland, high potential to advance the soil organic carbon storage in future. One has to be careful. It is a challenge, and I close with that, since if you go through the detailed balances of nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, of the emission fluxes and of the stored carbon, not every balance is positive. So it is always a whole system option, as we say. So here, for example, if you combine in energy crops, net, it's better to have like poplar or willow has a positive net balance there. And then there's this carbon pricing. So I used it usually in Austrian context. That's why second last view graph here is in German. But that is what Jochen Buchmeier will talk about. It will be important in this in the future carbon management that future policies of carbon prices integrate accountable, reliable, long-term carbon storage at the positive side of paying prices for carbon tons to the farmers if they do it properly. And that should be part of policy. So make humus part of carbon management. So we actually start out in these regions here in this state of Styria of Austria actively, also at the science policy interface, to really implement it on a larger scale. And with that, after a little more than 50 minutes, I say thank you for your attention, and welcome actually to use these slides later and ask questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kirkengast. That's a pretty full explanation of the background as to why we're focusing on carbon storage in soils and its importance. And I think you were also quite open and honest that this is a complex balance that we're trying to achieve here. But that was an excellent start. I think we'll move straight on now to hear about the regulatory environment in which we're going to, I hope, bring about more action on bringing about more carbon storage in agricultural soils. And to talk us through this is Josef Ivan, who works in the European Commission in DG Agri on the unit that deals with environment, climate change, forestry and bioeconomy. So Josef, over to you to explain the European policy context for all this.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here and then that I can share with you the Commission's thinking around carbon farming and the potential contribution it can make to the objectives of the European Green Deal. And in my presentation, I will follow up the idea which my previous colleague who was talking raised, and it's about accountable, reliable carbon storage. That will be basically the top, also the topic of my presentation. And now I will share my screen to start my presentation. Okay. Yes. Okay. The impact assessment prepared for the 2030 climate target plan concludes that the current EU energy and climate framework is insufficient and not ambitious enough. And the current legislation and efforts would lead us to an emission reduction of 45% below the 1990 level by 2030, without taking into account the net removals from the LULUCF. Although this is above the 2030 climate targets of 40%, but according to the projections, it would achieve only 60% emission reductions by 2050. And this is very far away from climate neutrality. The EU climate law is a major milestone in implementing the Green Deal, let me highlight some of these key elements of this new law. In this new law, the most often quoted elements are the increased 2030 emission targets of at least 55% reduction by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050. However, what is less mentioned, I think, is that this 2030 target will give a priority to the further decarbonization of the economy instead of relying on offsetting emissions with net removers. And also this law will add an aspirational target of achieving negative emissions by beyond 2050. Furthermore, the Commission will also set reduction targets for 2040 and will publish a projected indicative greenhouse gas budgets at the EU level for the period 2030 and 50. And lastly, which I think is important, is that the economic sectors will be encouraged to prepare indicative voluntary roadmaps for climate neutrality. And here the Commission will act as a facilitator in these intersectoral dialogues. This figure illustrates the EU pathway to climate neutrality, which is decoupled from the economic growth. And this graph also shows that by 2050, net domestic emissions should be balanced out with the net removers from the LULUCF sectors, and to a lesser extent from carbon removal technologies. In 2050, the majority of the remaining emissions will come from non-CO2 emissions, and is especially from the agriculture sector, and to a lesser extent from transport and the industry. Nature-based carbon sinks play a crucial role in the transition to the climate neutrality, especially for the forestry and agriculture. Since 1990, the land use and the forestry sector have removed more from the atmosphere than and it removed an average of 300 million tons of CO2 equivalent annually. However, there were huge variations from one year to another. In 2018, net removals accounted for 264 million tons in the climate inventories. With no policy changes, it is expected that the next sink will further decrease to 225 million tons, and this is shown in the no debit column in the graph. But it is also possible to bring the LULUCF sink up to 340 million tons by 2030 through appropriate policies and actions taken at the EU, national and local level. And this is shown by the LULUCF plus column in the graph. And according to the projections made in the impact assessment, by 2050, agricultural land will no longer be a net emitter, and forest land will be removing substantially more CO2 from the atmosphere. And by that time, the entire LULUCF sector could balance out around approximately 425 million tons of residual emissions from other sectors. And this slide shows the sectoral non-CO2 emission reductions projected at the different carbon prices and policy scenarios that were made in the impact assessment. Currently, non-CO2 emissions from methane, nitrous oxide, and the F gases represents around 20% of EU's total emissions, and most of it comes from the agriculture, waste, and the industry sectors. But by 2030, these emissions could be reduced effectively by up to 35% compared to 2015 by further reductions in these sectors. And according to these projections, the technical mitigation potentials for non-CO2 emissions could amount to over 150 million tons of CO2 equivalent of emissions avoided, without taking into account the lifestyle changes. And to sum up some of the key messages on emissions and removals, what we can say is that we need to have a growing sink. And there's a risk that with unchanged land use practices and diverse effect of natural hazards could potentially further reduce carbon sinks to 225 million tons by 2030. There are a number of practices that can help to reverse this trend, such as sustainable soil management, increasing soil organic carbons in mineral soils, rewetting of peatlands, restoration of wetlands, agroforestry developments, sustainable forest management, reforestation and afforestation measures. And there's a potential to revert this trend and increase net carbon removals to around 300 million tons by 2030. However, we need to carefully plan these actions due to the long lead times that exist for forestry, but also in carbon sequestration in soils as well. As regards emissions from non-CO2 emissions in agriculture, while these emissions can never be fully eliminated under existing technology and management options, they can be significantly reduced while ensuring food security. There are a number of mitigation practices available, such as efficient fertilizer use, precision farming techniques, livestock herd and health management, animal feeding and feed additives, low emission manure management, and application techniques. As I mentioned before, we should also keep in mind the mitigation potential resulting from changing consumer choices towards healthy diets and more sustainable produced foods, and the reduction of food waste, although this is not the topic of today's discussion. But we have to keep in mind that their mitigation potential could be of the same order of magnitude as the technical options available to reduce emissions in the agriculture sector. And the Commission impact assessment to the 2030 climate target plan confirmed the need to review the current climate and energy policy architecture. The revised LULUCF regulation, together with the other pieces of this architecture, forming a part of this Fit for 55 package, will be reviewed, and it will due by July 2021. Concerning the carbon farming initiatives, it is clear that farmers and foresters need to be directly incentivized to store more carbon on their land and in their forest. And to this end, the Commission will publish a communication by the end of this year on carbon farming initiative. The aim is, of this communication will be to explore mechanisms that reward climate-friendly practices through financial incentives. As regards the certification of carbon removers, the availability of data is important, but the quantification of the mitigation actions needs also a trusted and widely agreed methodology on which certification schemes, carbon credit markets, and labels can rely on. This will be key for further upscaling this new business model for the farmers. The Commission is developing a regulatory framework for the certification of carbon removers based on robust and transparent carbon accounting to monitor and verify the authenticity of carbon removers. For the moment, DG Klima runs a technical study on designing such a carbon remover certification mechanism. The first deliverable is expected by the end of this year, and there will be an impact assessment and open public consultation planned for the next year, and the legislative proposal foreseen somewhere by the end of 2022 and in 2023. And I turn on carbon farming. The nature-based solutions that remove carbon from the atmosphere can help the EU to achieve climate neutrality and should therefore be rewarded. Carbon farming is the process of changing agricultural practices or land use to increase the amount stored in the soil and the biomass, or to reduce emissions from livestock and crop production, and also from soil. So their objectives is twofold: sequestration and avoidance of emissions. And there are many carbon farming approaches currently available and being developed as we speak. For example, enhancing soil organic carbon in depleted arable land, and protecting carbon-rich soils such as wetland, peatlands, and also grasslands. In this context, the farm-to-fork strategy and biodiversity strategy, and also the upcoming soil strategy will support policies and actions to implement sustainable soil and management practices, soil protection, and the restoration of degraded land. Another example of carbon farming is emission reduction at farm level, which mainly concerns non-CO2 emissions. Here I could mention the EU methane strategy, which include specific actions to support reduction of methane emissions in agriculture. Another approach is applying biomass for the production of long-lasting bio-based products. Here, for example, the nature-based materials such as wood and bio-based products play an important role in the new European Bauhaus initiative under the new renovation wave strategy. They are stocking. They stock carbon emissions in buildings and avoid emissions from using conventional construction materials. And lastly, planting of new forests, restoration of degraded forest, and improving the management of existing forest is another example and potential pathway for developing carbon farming and sequestration. Apart from climate objectives, carbon farming should also aim to achieve multiple economic and environmental co-benefits. It can reduce production cost, provide an alternative source of income to farmers and foresters, and can improve animal welfare. It enhances biodiversity, including in soils, improve flood protection, water and climate regulation through soils. But there are many other ecosystem services that to which it can contribute. And finally, healthy soils can also mitigate effects of climate change and increase farm resilience. As regards the common agricultural policy, I would like to highlight that the new feature of the future CAP, such as the higher flexibility, the result-based delivery model, and the higher climate ambition, together with the new support measures, which will allow member states to support the setting up of carbon farming initiatives and the certification schemes. Through the country recommendation to the CAP strategic plans, the Commission encourages member states to support farmers in deploying sustainable soil management practices, including improved crop rotations, conservation tillage, catch and cover crops, and carbon farming approaches. And sustainably managing grassland and agricultural soils will be essential for emission reductions and climate adaptation and sequestration as well. Currently, DG Agri runs a study which will deliver a greenhouse gas accounting module to the farm sustainability tool for nutrient management. This tool can be used to measure farm-level carbon emissions and removals in a homogeneous way across the EU. The Commission also aims to improve the monitoring of soil in the upcoming soil strategy with key contributions from the EU Soil Observatory and the European Soil Data Center as well. The new soil mission under the Horizon Europe will propose novel approaches to research and innovation in combination with education, training, investments, and the demonstration of good practices using living labs and lighthouse projects. It will also work in tandem with the CAP, and in particular with the AEP Agri local action groups to test, demonstrate, and deploy solutions on the field with the help of collaboration of farmers, researchers, and the other stakeholders from the civil society as well. Yeah. The Commission recently created a web page dedicated to carbon farming with where it will post regular updates on this initiative. Several workshops have been organized with the stakeholders on carbon farming already, and the latest one has just took place today this morning, and where the topic was the relationship between the carbon farming and the common agricultural policy. The Commission also published a couple of weeks ago a technical guidance handbook on how to set up and implement result-based carbon farming in the EU. In this handbook, it also explained a number of existing and promising schemes which could be inspirational for upscaling carbon farming in the EU. these areas is the wetland restoration and rewetting, agroforestry, livestock farm carbon audit, maintenance of soil organic carbon on grasslands, and livestock farm carbon audit. And this handbook can serve as a guidance to the private actors and the public authorities to help them with the startup of carbon farming schemes. There's a lot of work already ongoing on carbon farming. It is clear from all these discussions that there's still a lot of open questions around this initiative. Let me highlight some of these questions and that we are currently discussing within the Commission and also with the stakeholders and those who are already implementing carbon farming initiatives together and collect their experiences. As regards the governance, there are already many examples of carbon farming schemes, there's a large variety of involvements of the EU, member states, stakeholders, researchers, sectoral stakeholders, companies in the food value chain, and environmental NGOs in the design and implementation of these schemes. One task that we have is to look at the role that all these participants, all these actors can play in the developing, reviewing, controlling, and the managing of the methodologies, carbon farming projects, the verification of the of actions, preventing fraud and double counting, keeping a registry of carbon credits, and also the linking the scheme with the national emissions registries. As regards coverage, the diversity of farming systems and situations and the objectives of the carbon farming raises another question. And the question is whether we should focus on schemes applicable to widespread farming systems or a more highly targeted scheme. The former could potentially result in a greater overall impact, but with a lower benefit per unit area, while the other could be applicable to small areas with a high impact. An important area is additionality and the baseline, and there the main questions, some of the main questions that we have and need to answer is how can we ensure environmental and regulatory additionality but avoid the risk of carbon leakage? How can we deal with the financial additionality and avoid double financing in the light of increased climate financing through the CAP and through other sources? How to deal with setting baselines for farms that are already performing well, where the remaining mitigation potential is low? And what mechanisms can we use to deal with the risk of reversal, for example? In relation to the MRV, there's a trade-off between monitoring accuracy and the cost, and there the question is what is the level of environmental certainty that we can accept to reduce such cost, and to what extent can we reduce monitoring and verification costs through the use of space technologies, farm data collected already through the CAP.
Yes,
and on,
if you
yes.
could draw your remarks to close. Yeah, thank you.
Just one more minute. And as regards funding, the transition will require significant public and private investments. And there, the question is how can we increase the capital flows to carbon farming? Concerning the soil organic carbon, the mitigation potential that can be achieved by agricultural practices is highly dependent on both the agroecological context and the way the farming practices are implemented on the farm and on the parcel. It takes many years to increase soil organic matter, but could fall very quickly due to weather hazards, droughts, or inappropriate agricultural practices. The challenge is how to maintain the deployment of these sustainable farming practices and avoid reversal, but take into account this external variability. And my closing remark on relation to the role of the CAP. The new CAP will provide a number of possibilities for funding carbon farming, but it needs to be programmed by the member states into interventions. And due to the flexibility given by these result-based schemes to reach objectives, the role played by the farm advisory services is in giving farm-specific advice will become even greater. And I think these are the two key messages on at least in relation to the CAP that I would like to pass. And with that, I would just draw your attention to some of these links which provide further information on the things that I have said. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Josef. That was definitely a comprehensive run through the wide spectrum of activity that's now taking place, pushing towards the climate goal of neutrality by 2050. So that's extremely helpful, and thank you for including in particular those follow-up links that people can go and find those documents, because we've all got now a lot of catching up for this huge body of work that the Commission has done in producing the climate law and the proposals on how we're going to achieve it. What's stunning to me when I hear a presentation like that, I mean, the Commission, they talked about the 5 strategies aimed towards agriculture, farm to fork, biodiversity, methane, forest and soil, and we hope they're all going to be joined up. There's 5 strategies, but only one policy with the big funding, which is the CAP. And so marrying these is clearly monumentally complex. And I think that last slide that Josef showed, that there's a lot of quite significant challenges out there that we've got to get our heads around. And yet the paradox is that there is a complex regulatory framework here that's coming into place. And yet the essential ideas of what we're trying to do to get more organic matter back into soils and to restore the health of our soils in fact, not so massively complex. And I think that will come across as we now turn to our 3 practical examples, starting with the initiative that Azadeh Farajpour is going to take us through. Azadeh is from the Research Institute for Applied Knowledge Processing from Ulm, which is an interesting institute which is co-sponsored by the state of Baden-Württemberg and a number of large-scale practical industrial enterprises. Their focus is on applying knowledge in the field, and Azadeh is going to explain their efforts on soil management. Azadeh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, for giving me the word. The Better Soil Initiative actually summarizes many of the aspects the previous speakers already mentioned. Thank you for sharing the slides. Better Soil for a Better World is an initiative for improving soil quality for climate protection, climate resilience, and sustainable food production. Therefore, the enhancement and formation of soil organic matter and humus is essential. I believe the agricultural sector can be transformed from the polluter of greenhouse gas emissions to a protector of the climate system by focusing on 4 principles: soil treatment, compost, biochar, and agroforestry. By applying these principles, which include proper crop management, farmers are able to close the nitrogen and carbon cycles. This is because the soils bind carbon and nitrogen rather than releasing them into the atmosphere. The knowledge is already there. I have been to many conferences talking to farmers, politicians, scientists, people from NGOs and the corporate sector. People want to act, but don't know where to start. Others know what to do, but don't have the resources for it. Some have the resources, but don't know where to reliably spend them so that the impact is high. This was the beginning of the Better Soil Initiative in early spring last year. I wanted to bring those different actors together to facilitate a multi-stakeholder movement and exchange at different levels, improving our soils for climate protection and a sustainable food system requires the engagement from a range of actors, from farmers on the ground, from scientists and in universities and research, from people in business and corporate sector, as well as food industry, and from politicians to shape the right boundary conditions for the restoration of our soils, bringing back their values to our ecosystems and our societies. One day, Franz Fischler said in a speech that if there was a paper summarizing the main aspects of our problems regarding soil, we should try to bring it to Brussels. I picked up the idea, wrote the discussion paper, and found many, many supporters from different sectors for the paper, from scientists, from farmers, from politicians, and from people from private sector. So far, the paper has been translated into 6 and 7 European languages by volunteers, and I'm very happy that we are indeed discussing the issue of better soils on the European level, the European Parliament today. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Azadeh. And I hope we'll get a chance to pick up some of the details of those 4 principles, because I say it doesn't look that complicated, and yet I discover, and I think we will discover that when we get to the details, there's not always full agreement. Let's move on and look at a second practical example of an initiative that is interacting with land managers, with farmers on the ground. And Jochen Buchmeier is going to tell us about the project, the Ökoregion Keindorf. He's the CEO of this project in Eastern Austria, which Professor Kirkengass made several references to. So Jochen, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation. Good afternoon to everyone. I want to talk briefly about the potentials and necessities of carbon farming on behalf of the Ökoregion Keindorf. As you can see, we mostly act with farmers all over Austria. So we have currently 350 farmers in Austria, mostly in arable land, also some grassland farmers. For those who don't know our program yet, I will briefly explain how it works. The farmer agrees upon entering into the program with a field of up to 5 hectares. This sets off with a start sampling. After this start sampling, the farmer has 3 to 7 years of putting into practice everything he thinks is useful for building up humus. After these 3 to 7 years, we have a success sampling and see if the farmer has been successful. So if the farmer raised more than 0.3% of humus, we call it a success, and the farmer agrees to continuing for 5 more years of keeping this level of humus. After an additional 5 years, we have a control sampling. Yeah, the fees we pay to the farmers after the first sampling, 3/3 of the fee. If the farmer continues to be successful, that's the third, and this cycle can be continued as long as the farmer wants and as long as the farmer is being successful. This is briefly how soil sampling looks like. It's done manually and it's done with a GPS coordinate so that we know very well 25 points over the field. And the same points will be sampled all over for the upcoming years also. As Professor Kirkengass said before, we can only expect a change in humus and a change in carbon if we change our management practices. Yeah, so the practices which we recommend and which we've seen over the years, which proved to be successful, are basically very simple. Yeah, what we recommend to farmers is maximize diversity. Diversity in the crop rotation, mixed cropping, yeah. Maximize productivity, so maximize the photosynthesis activity, produce more biomass, which can be done especially through winter cropping or cover crops. This is time which is very often not used, or space which is not used. And on the other hand, we recommend to reduce tillage, especially plowing, and reduce chemical disturbances, especially pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and mineral fertilizers. A little outline of our project. We have 14 years of experience and data. As I already said, 350 farmers managing more than 4,500 hectares all over Austria. We already verified more than 12,000 tons have been stored in these soils, and we were already able to pay more than 400,000 euros to our farmers as success fees. This is a little graphics of how successful the farmers actually are. Till now, here on the left, you see the most successful ones. On the right, farmers which are not successful. An average of 6 tons of CO2 per hectare and per year have been stored all over, including the ones which were not able to store extra carbon. So this makes them 76% successful. So more than 3/3 of the farmers have been successful. And as already mentioned, 6 tons of CO2 is more or less the potential which we have as an average. If we apply this average to all the arable land of the European Union, which is more than 100 million hectares, we could store an additional 640 million tons of CO2 per year. If all these farmers applied similar managements. Although we have to add to this probably that all the soils are different, all the countries have different measurements which will prove to be successful. But this is more or less a number which we can orient to and which we can see is a big potential. If we put this into perspective, it's around 18% of the entire CO2 equivalent emissions of the European Union. So this is also which Asade said before. Agriculture could become from an emitter to an actually storer of carbon, of CO2 equivalent emissions, which is basically the one thing which we talk about, instead of emitting, becoming the place of storage. What do we need to be more successful? So what are necessities of initiatives such as ours? It has already been addressed also by Joseph Ivan, that permanence is a big issue. Permanence is an issue which we don't feel that we can deal with this issue by ourselves, because farmers, they will not agree to make a contract of a lifetime or even more generations, which would be necessary to guarantee storage over the years. So our program runs usually up to 12 years. So what we would need for permanence is a legal framework that guarantees the maintenance of SOC levels and the soil functions. So this is really where I would call politicians, and especially on the European level, to step in and think of a legal framework which could guarantee this. Another need which we have is more coordination on the European level to implement European standards and assure quality. We have seen over the last years more initiatives popping up. There is still quite uncertainty and also some doubts among people whether it works or not. What would be necessary would be more credibility. So we would need to create European standards that assure this quality and assure also credibility. And which has also been mentioned before by Asade, improved coordination and exchange between stakeholders is very, very important. There is so much knowledge already out there of initiatives, of politicians, of science. We would really have to need a basis where we could all meet and coordinate better. So better coordination exchange is a big necessity of our initiative. So summing up, the level of SOC is the single most significant and reliable indicator for soil functions and soil health. So as it is such an important factor, we decided to make the result-based payments and grants due to this factor, and we really have best experience with it. So we really recommend to take the SOC, the soil organic carbon, more into considerations also on the European level and the CAP strategies. Soil and its functions have to be protected as a common good by European law. So just as we protect other resources as water, as air, also soil has to be seen as a common good which has to be protected for us and for future generations. Yeah? And the carbon level, the SOC, is one of the indicators which could be taken for this. Collaboration with policymakers is urgently needed, as I just said before, to make sure that permanence and quality standards are being guaranteed. And last but not least, but very, very important, farmers have to be accompanied and supported substantially on this process, yeah, because they are the ones who are doing the work which we need, and they have to be supported economically and with know-how. The responsibility, and I really want to call it a responsibility to maintain the soil functions within the CAP strategy plans. And it's a responsibility which we give to the farmers, but I think we have to understand it as a responsibility of mankind to really maintain these soils healthy and protected. Yeah? So that's from my side. Let's protect and regenerate our earth together. Let's protect soils together. Thank you very much. And I give back to Alan Buckwell.
Jochen, thank you. That's very heartening that you've got such clear, concrete results of success, that this can be done. And I think you've very neatly summarized some of the key challenges to turn this this experimental initiative, which is still quite a large experiment with quite a lot of farmers and land involved, but how to upscale this across your country and the rest of the EU. So let's have a look at another effort to do a very similar thing that Frank Russell, who is chairman of the interest group, the Interessengemeinschaft Gesunder Boden, which is focused on the humus economy in Germany. So Franz, tell us about your program and how it's working.
Yes, imagine there was something that can regulate the climate, improve the water quality, prevent flooding, increase biodiversity, improve the health of plants, animals, and humans. What could that be? What do you need for that? Healthy, lively, humus-rich soils. But why isn't this already our reality? Because we were only interested in the earnings on one side and not in the health of the soil. For centuries, we force-fed our plants, which led to plant illnesses. Instead of removing the cause, we fought the symptoms with plant protection products. And with it, we ignored the consequences on soil health. Due to the type of tillage, we have severely damaged our soils, especially subfloors, almost everywhere. All those points have contributed to damaging the most important thing should be observed in the soil-plant system: symbiosis. Relationships that support each other. We ignored that in the agriculture practice, soil is an organism. The very important humus in the soil is the result of the symbiotic process. The partners of the symbiotic process are the plants with their excretions of their roots, the soil life, and the soil itself. With this, you can clearly see that our agriculture practice, which normally does not notice or hurt the symbiotic processes, is exactly the reason why our soil is in the condition it is in, and why the wished soil function cannot be fulfilled. So if you want healthy soil, which brings all those benefits I told you at the beginning, you have to focus on promoting those symbiotic processes. In Germany, more and more practitioners are implementing this in their farms and companies as a basis of their actions. They align their work so that the health of their soil improves. The practice proves that not only the health of the plants improves, but also the earnings are much more stable and higher than conventional. In the practice, you can see it at our model companies. Please feel free to contact me. I'm always at your disposal. How this exactly works, you can read in our position paper, Healthy Soil, Our Perspective. So if we not focus our efforts one-sidedly again, this time on the climate impact of the soil, but rather promote soil health. We also published a position paper regarding the CO2 certification to agriculture. What is to be done? Let's not get advice only from agents of chemical companies who will only tell you what to add to your soil. They only notice the soil chemistry anyways and ignore the soil physics and the soil biology. Encourage your farmers to build knowledge about soil health. For this, use the principles from our position paper, Healthy Soil from Our Perspective. With regional partnerships, you can give your farmers more money for extraordinary accomplishments which promote the health of the soil and thus its soil functions. Do not wait for European Union agricultural policy. Every person should have the possibility to be taught about the effects of healthy soil. Do this out of interest in improving the climate, healthy water, plants, animals, and people, and for the preservation of the creation. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, it's really heartening to hear these positive stories of actions that are actually going on. So thank you for that. We've got very little time left, and so I'm going to focus the questions and the debate in the remaining few minutes before we ask Franz Fischler to sum up. Let me just start by asking Professor Kierkegaard and perhaps also Josef Ivan to comment. Are we confident from a scientific basis that we know how to measure soil organic carbon and how to certify, how to set up a certification scheme that can be adopted across the EU and therefore have a common standard across the European Union and be practical and implementable at the farm level? So can you just say a few words about measurement and certification?
Maybe I say something on the measurement side. I think it's rather mature. So the way of, and Joachim Buchmeier was referring to rather simple techniques also. They're sophisticated, simple techniques. So the short answer is this is rather mature. It could be operationally done sort of every 3 years. So if you roll out like a countrywide, European-wide programs, you can very accountably do it. And for the legal and governance issues, I hand over to Josef.
Josef.
What was the question concerning the governance? I didn't catch.
How close
to the legal side, Josef, would be that how could we make it happen that we have a European-wide certification, really? So that reliable long-term carbon storage in the soil is really accounted for, that you can price it, that you can pay the farmers for it, and so.
Yeah, well, concerning the measurement, it's true, but first you have to take into account the high variability of the soil quality. So you need a lot of measurement points. So if you start increasing your certainty on the carbon storage, it means that you need more and you need to increase the sample points on your land. So there's a trade-off between precision and precision cost and cost of the verification. In terms of sampling, it's really mature, but it's the question of the application, and that's one of the question. This trade-off which we need to look at also when we come to the certification, because the certification will be key to ensure that these carbon credits, 1 ton of CO2 actually means 1 ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere in other parts of the economy. So the certification of this measurement, or that this removal is real and permanent, will be key. And that's I think that's the one of the key purpose of this initiative, and the Commission is working on this EU-wide certification schemes.
It's good to hear they're working on it now. I wonder why
Yes.
they weren't 10 or 20 years ago. This is not a new problem. But what I seriously wonder, given the obvious practical difficulties of doing this on a common basis across the EU, would it not be better to focus on the practices that increase humus and get those into place whilst you're developing the certification? If you stress too much on results, and it turns out we can't measure the results satisfactorily and convincingly, because this has got to be done globally, not just by the European Union, if it's going to have any impact, then shouldn't be working on the adoption of the practices, which is what our 3 practical examples mostly focused on. What are your views?
And also, just to add, Alan, adoption of the practice, I agree with you, but also adoption of the latest science that is there. So we are on a very promising way, actually, to support all those verification issues, so that is basically done. And I would argue from transformation research side, do it and adaptively improve. So also in certification schemes, you don't just wait and solve everything to fine detail, but do it, and while you go, you adaptively improve.
Yes, okay, thank you. I want to bring in Jochen Buchmeier at this point. Can you say a bit about the payments? Who's paying for your soil sampling and for the rewards? Is this coming from the Austrian government, from the region, from the CAP? And do the payments continue indefinitely?
Mm-hmm. For the soil sampling, actually, farmer themselves, they have to pay. So this is the, let's say, the risk that they have to take when they participate in our program, which is 290 euros per sample at the moment. Yeah, and this is also the only risk and the only, let's say, agreement they get into with us. Yeah. For the grants or for the success fee, which we pay, the private sector is paying. So it's basically companies who want to make up for their footprint, who want to reduce their emissions. They do it on a voluntary basis. So they pay, at the moment it's 45 euros per ton, which they pay for reducing their emissions. And the demand is so high that there would be way more companies willing to buy if we could produce.
I think this is fantastic news, that if there are ways of setting this up and funding it in addition or outside the CAP, which we know always turns into a very cumbersome instrument for doing this sort of thing, then that's a great story. But I can see we have to avoid double funding. But I think that the last remarks in Frank Russell's presentation, don't wait for the CAP to give the right signals, get on with it. This is exactly what you're doing.
And also, I would add, for the pricing policies, since we've done recent studies that clearly show that if one is going for carbon pricing now also nationally as part of let's say, national effort sharing in countries, it can be part of the income from carbon pricing that is used for accountable long-term carbon storage. And the prices that could be paid to farmers could start at 60 euro per ton, basically, even if the program has some cost, if you start with national carbon prices at the order of 60 to 100 euros. So it is proven that if you want to get rid of what I call the compensation trap, so that the ones are offsetting emissions that they actually should practically reduce by just buying into soil. So we have to overcome that by professional carbon management, and we can. But I just argue for the public policy side that is very useful and economically fair, actually, to go away where you put in part of the carbon price income into the storage that is accountably and done in the long term.
Okay, we've almost run out of time because I want to give 7 minutes to Franz Fischler to draw the threads together. I just want to ask Asade, you mentioned one of your 4 principles was biochar. Is this controversial? Does everyone agree that biochar is an important route to more carbon in the soil and could be extended across the EU indefinitely? Well, over a period of the next 3 decades.
Well, I think our science is also controversial. So you find positive articles about also compost and negative articles about compost, also positive articles on agroforestry, a negative one. So I think we must be open for everything. We must have the same goal to go for improving soil quality through enhancing humus. So if biochar can contribute to that, why not? And I don't know if you have ever heard of terra preta in Brazil. So this soil have been built up, or humus has been built up over thousands of years by putting also biochar as a component in the soil. So this is not, we do not invent any knowledge. We only need to practice it, to put it on the ground, bring it from theory into practice, and make our science and knowledge more applicable and understandable, and close the transfer gap of knowledge, raising awareness that Better Soil discussion paper tries to do. And networks are the key to bring actors from different sectors together to improve what also you, Achim, said, to contribute or to increase contribution also from private sector, not only policy. Policy is also one part. Farmers are also one part of the big puzzle. We need to improve policies that better soil principles can be recognized, agroforestry can be paid on the political level, and rewarding measurements. We need to pay farmers when they put carbon in the soil and increase carbon enhancement.
I think we all agree on that. It's with huge regret that I have to draw the general discussion to a close, but I'd like to invite Franz Fischler to summarize where he thinks we've reached. Franz.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron, for giving me the floor. As everybody who is participating in this conference can imagine, it is the easiest part what I have to do now, because we got so many arguments and so many suggestions what to do and what not to do, and policy advice and so on and so forth. And I have more or less 5 minutes. So therefore, I would like to limit myself to some political issues, which in my view are important if we would like to make progress in this field. And let me start with what Mr. Dorfmann said in his introduction. He said that this morning started the final trilogue about the reform of the CAP. And we have then later on seen that also on the Commission side, when it comes to carbon farming, we are more or less at the beginning. So it's no doubt that we are very late with our discussion, but this doesn't mean that this is therefore less important. It is even more important that we start up this discussion and that we make in due time the necessary progress. So when we usually speak about greenhouse gas emissions and how to reduce them, then we speak about mitigation issues and adaptation issues. And all the farmers and the farming community is well aware what in this respect has to be done. So there is the question of how can we reduce the energy which is necessary to produce all the mineral fertilizers, what has to be done to reduce in the crop management the energy use, and so on and so forth. But so far, we have not much discussed the positive side, which is also part of what agriculture can contribute to the decarbonization of our economies and of our world. And therefore, let's concentrate on that. And here, I think there are several policy instruments which were mentioned and which are now very important in my view. So Mr. Ivan said that it should be possible to have a carbon neutral bioeconomy by 2035. So this means that from that onwards, agriculture is a net contributor to other economic areas and helps also other economic areas to reach the decarbonization as it is requested by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. The main things which are now important is, first of all, that we need clear standards. This was mentioned by many speakers. We have to be clear about what we are doing and what effects our actions have. We have heard that this is measurable. This is no longer very expensive, so it can be done, and therefore one should do it. And here I think an initiative by the European Commission would be very helpful. For that, in addition, we need the necessary decisions. And these decisions must be done partly by the Commission itself, because the Commission has competencies for that, but partly, I'm sure it has to be done also by the Council, because the Member States have to be involved in this process, and we need certain rules which can only be decided by the Member States. And here, I think the new approach which was chosen in the CAP reform plays an important role. The so-called strategic plans, which are requested in the coming years from the Commission side, by the Member States and by the farming communities. Here, the issue of carbon farming has to be integrated, must become part of these strategic plans. The other issue, which was several times mentioned, is the question of incentives. And here I agree with all those who said it is not so much, and should not be so much, an issue of the rural development policy, of the second pillar of the CAP, or of the CAP at all. I was wondering when I listened to all the speakers that nobody mentioned the ETS, the European trading system. And if I understand correctly, what Mr. Buchmeier said is in principle, let's say, a mini concept, but with the same effect and with the same target to have on the one side the positive decarbonization effects, the storage of carbon in the soils, and on the other side you have a certain price for that. You get a payment, and this payment is paid by the polluters, so to say. And this is exactly the principle how the ETS works. So why do we not start a discussion about ways and possibilities to include this policy, this carbon farming into the ETS system? So far, if I understand well, there was some hesitation, mainly because it was not so clear whether or how exact the measurements of the soils, of the carbon storage in the soils are. So we have heard today there is a lot of improvement. This is doable, so let's do it, therefore. And then in addition to all this, it would be really make the public discussion about how expensive the CAP is much easier also. So also in this respect, I think it could be a more market-related measure to give incentives for those who store carbon in the soils, would be, in my view, a much more promising concept than the traditional compensation payments, which we all know. And I think I myself have some experience in this respect. But now it's the time that we introduce new concepts, that we think further, and that we find ways how we can integrate more agriculture into the general economic development and into the general reduction of CO2 emissions in our economy. So there is a third element, I think, and this is the communication aspect. It is really of utmost importance that we communicate what we are planning and what we would like to introduce and to do. I think our citizens must understand that here is a field where the modern agricultural sector can contribute a lot so that the global warming will be reduced. And also for the farmers, it is important that they understand the importance of the soil management, because as we all know, a good soil management has also other positive aspects, improvements in the soil, more storage of water in the soil, less erosion in the soils, and so on and so forth. So also this aspect is, in my view, important. To get all these things up and running, I would suggest two things. One thing is that all those who are interested in a proper soil management and in these concepts which we are discussing today here in this conference, that they go together, they start also cooperating with each other. We in this respect is the initiative from Mr. Buchmeier in Austria, but also the German initiatives and some other initiatives are prepared to start a kind of association so that we can better represent the interests of or the the interests of all the stakeholders in this field. And the second point I would like to make, I think we need more in-depth discussion and in-depth analysis. So therefore, I would also recommend that, let's say in the fall of the year, also together with the European Commission, another conference is organized where we can then a bigger conference where we then can develop all those thoughts which we started to discuss today. Then I think that also the member states, the farming associations, and all the other stakeholders in agriculture should be involved in this discussion. And then I think Mr. Ivan will get the necessary support that his suggestions from the Commission side will end up with a positive decision and will be a success for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I guess that concludes the event. Unless Herbert Dorfmann wants to say anything, then I guess we close because we're already a little over time. But thank all the speakers and thank you for all of those who tuned in and participated. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Mr. Dorfmann, we cannot hear you. You are maybe still unmuted.
I think Mr. Dorfmann left the conference because he is again involved in the discussion in the parliament.
Yeah.
Okay, so bye-bye everyone and all the best, and thank you for participating and contributing.
Have a good evening, day, afternoon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.